My name is Simon Cooper, though I'm not fussy about what people call me. I've been married to Grace for 4 years, and we're still enjoying our kid-free life. We both like our freedom a bit too much right now, and though we might want children someday, it won't be until we're well into our 30s. We both grew up in modest circumstances, living only a few blocks from each other, but didn't actually meet until we were 18 at a college recruitment fair. Grace excelled at college, eventually becoming an accountant and credit controller. I, on the other hand, struggled academically and didn't graduate. However, my lack of formal education was compensated by a strong work ethic and a head for business. By 15, I was cleaning local businesses and offices, and by 18, I was managing a 30-person team and had contracts with several major companies in our city. Grace was looking for work at the time, and I needed more staff. When she approached my table at the recruitment event, she handed me her resume and said, "I'm not looking for a cleaning job, but maybe you'd be interested in my phone number." I didn't hesitate. I called her before she even made it to the next table and asked her out for dinner the following evening. 4 years later, we were married. That event was fortunate for Grace in another way too. She landed a job in the purchasing department of a construction firm. Starting at the entry level, she worked her way up the ladder and, after 8 years, became the head of both purchasing and credit control. Thanks to our combined salaries and the absence of children, we lived quite comfortably. My business also thrived, and after acquiring 2 competitors, I built it into the largest office and retail cleaning company in the city. It's often the cleaners and security guards who are the first to notice anything out of the ordinary in offices, and their observations often fuel speculation among the staff. About 4 months ago, I was at my desk when my secretary informed me that a gentleman was waiting to see me in reception. She handed me a business card, Kyle Foster, private investigator. I asked her to show him in. When Kyle entered, I shook his hand and asked him his business. After some initial pleasantries, he sat down and smiled. "Before we get started, could I get a coffee?" "Haven't had one all day, and I'm desperate." I could empathize. Most business owners run on caffeine. My secretary quickly brought in 2 mugs from the coffee machine, complete with milk and sugar, but neither of us touched them. After a bit more small talk, I steered the conversation towards the reason for his visit. "So, Kyle, what can I do for you?" He grinned. "Please, call me Kyle. As you can see from my card, I'm a private investigator. I'm working for a client who suspects his wife is having, or is about to have, an affair. The wife works as an accountant at Hancock Manufacturing, one of your city's larger suppliers. Recently, the company hired a new salesman, Jared Nelson. Jared has a reputation for pursuing married women. He's been sending flowers, texting late at night, and taking my client's wife out for lunch. Pretty standard stuff, until now. But here's the thing. He's pushing for an overnight trip with her. I listened, mildly entertained by the cloak and dagger aspect, but then something clicked. I knew that company name. Grace's firm also sourced materials from Hancock, and this Jared Nelson sounded like someone I needed to keep away from my wife. I glanced at Kyle, who was clearly waiting for my response. "Okay, I understand." "How can I help?" I asked. His smile broadened. "Glad you asked. Jared leaves flowers, notes, and other personal items on her desk, which she usually throws away. Your cleaning staff could collect anything connected to him and pass it on to us. We'd run everything by our legal team first. There's no legal issue with collecting discarded personal trash, and her employer has already given us the green light." He handed me a card with the CEO's number, suggesting I could call to confirm. I didn't need to. The CEO's number was already in my phone. I dialed, and he answered immediately. Without preamble, he said, "Simon, I understand Kyle Foster is with you. You're authorized to share any non-company information with him. Our legal team will follow up with a formal letter. If you need anything else, give me a call." I hung up, impressed by how eager they were to resolve this. Kyle grinned. "So, are we on the same page?" "Yeah, it's all set," I replied. "Tell me what to look for, and we'll start separating her trash. You can collect it each day at 11 a.m. Will that work? Perfect, Kyle confirmed. I contacted my team, and Kyle briefed us on what to watch for: early lunches, late lunches, flowers, and notes. For about 6 weeks, we collaborated with Kyle. At the investigation's conclusion, one of my staff members reported that the woman hadn't returned after lunch. Kyle tracked them to a motel, and shortly thereafter, the marriage ended in divorce. Things returned to normal for us until one day Grace seemed a little distant. I tried to get her to talk, but she was unwilling to discuss it. About a week later, Zoe, one of my longest-serving employees, and someone I considered a close friend, came into my office. She'd been with me practically since the beginning, and at 25 years my senior, she treated me like a son. As she sat down, I sensed something was amiss. My name is Simon, and a few months ago, I was involved in a surveillance operation. Zoe, one of my longtime employees, brought it back to my attention. Remember that surveillance job a few months back? She asked cautiously. Of course. Quite an experience, I replied, raising an eyebrow. Well, she hesitated, I work in the same office as your wife now, and I've noticed something. The man we were keeping an eye on has been stopping by her office. I saw a large bouquet of flowers on her desk, and she took them with her to lunch. Here's the card that came with them. She handed me the card, and as I read it, my stomach dropped. Dear Grace, thank you for helping me renew my contract with your company. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. I hope you'll join me for lunch soon. With love, Jared. The note suggested a familiarity that made me uncomfortable. My wife was his next target. I thanked Zoe and asked her to keep me informed about any other notes or flowers. I immediately called Kyle. He picked up on the third ring. Simon, how can I help? I quickly filled him in. Zoe, one of my staffers who worked on the previous investigation, now works in Grace's office. She just told me that Jared Nelson has started paying her visits, taking her out to lunch, and sending flowers. I've got a card from him right here. Kyle took a deep breath. You're not the only one dealing with Jared. You're actually the third husband involved. Would you be interested in joining forces with the others? Absolutely, I replied. What's the next step? Kyle suggested a meeting with the other husbands at 2:00 p.m. Can you come by my office? We'll get the paperwork sorted and exchange any relevant information. I agreed and arrived at his office at 1:55 p.m. sharp. Inside, I met Billy Morgan and Terry Smith, along with Kyle and his associate Mark Perry, who was handling data collection for the case. Kyle started the meeting. Gentlemen, we're all here because you share a common problem. Billy, Terry, meet Simon. He's interested in joining the investigation. If you're both agreeable, we'll officially bring him on board and begin sharing information. They nodded, and after a brief discussion, everyone concurred. The paperwork took about 15 minutes, during which I used my personal credit card to cover the $5,000 fee, ensuring Grace wouldn't see anything suspicious on our shared statements. Once everything was finalized, Kyle addressed us. The shared issue is Jared Nelson. Simon just filled us in. Billy's wife works alongside Jared at Hancock Manufacturing, while Terry's wife is employed by the city's school board, which sources supplies from the same company. Jared has a very well-practiced routine. He sends flowers, texts, and takes these women out to lunch, usually trying to escalate things by luring them to a motel afterward. His pattern with married women is disturbing, pressuring those with children and taking advantage of those without by offering them a perceived escape from their husbands. Kyle paused, taking a sip of coffee. Over the past year, Jared has been responsible for at least 5 divorces in the area. His tactics don't vary much, but they're effective. He even got sued by a group of husbands in Dallas, where he used to work, after causing a string of broken marriages. The lawsuit resulted in his termination. But he's up to the same tricks here. Now we're doing everything we can to put a stop to it. He turned to me. Simon, are you still assigned cleaning at Hancock Manufacturing or the school board's offices? You might be able to gather valuable evidence from Grace's office trash if your team handles that area. I shook my head. No, unfortunately, we don't cover those locations. That's too bad, Kyle remarked. But keep collecting anything from Grace's trash that looks personal. We need every piece of information we can get. He then asked, "Who pays for your wife's phone bill?" "My company does," I responded. Kyle grinned. "Great. Here's what we'll do. We'll need to access her phone records to see who she's been texting and calling. Just fill out this authorization form, and it will grant us permission to monitor her phone. You'll also need to scan this QR code on her phone. Once you do, a program will install itself discreetly and begin transmitting all her calls, messages, emails, and WhatsApp chats to our server. Jared tends to avoid using landlines because it's too easy for spouses to answer accidentally, so most of his contact with these women happens on their cell phones. We wrapped up the meeting by exchanging phone numbers and creating a WhatsApp group for easier communication. It included me, Billy, Terry, Kyle, and Mark. The goal was to keep everyone informed and updated in real time. When I got home later that evening, Grace was already there, but she seemed preoccupied. She kept her phone close, which wasn't like her, and during our conversation, she seemed distant. When I asked about her day, she brushed me off, saying it was a long one, and that she felt tired. Then, at 9:30 p.m., much earlier than usual, she went to bed. I stayed up a bit longer, trying to shake the unease that had settled in. Once I knew she was asleep, I went to search for her phone, but it wasn't in its usual spot. I made my way to the bedroom. I noticed a phone charger near the bed, and when I took a closer look, I found it tucked beneath Grace's pillow. There was no way I could retrieve it without waking her, so I went to bed, my mind racing with anxiety. Luckily, in the middle of the night, she got up, giving me the perfect opportunity to scan the QR code, input the details, and return her phone without her noticing. Observing her unusual quietness the following morning, I watched as Grace drifted around the house without purpose before leaving for work. She barely acknowledged my presence, and I suspect she wouldn't have spoken at all if I hadn't initiated conversation. Around 11:30 a.m., Mark phoned from Kyle's office. They'd completed their preliminary analysis of the data dump, and Mark began to fill me in on their discoveries. Grace had created a new email account, seemingly exclusively for communication with Jared. "This is a break for us," Mark explained. "Initially, we were unsure how they were connecting, but now we have a lead. We're currently trying to gain access to Jared's emails as well." He continued, explaining that Jared's messages were incessant, constantly urging Grace to add excitement to her life, suggesting she needed novel experiences to revitalize our marriage. He even coerced her into revealing intimate details about our relationship, information he was now weaponizing against me. A knot formed in my stomach as Mark relayed the rest. Jared had alluded to a weekend trip during their recent lunch and was attempting to persuade Grace that their affair was purely physical, claiming that if she truly loved me, it shouldn't be considered infidelity. He was manipulating her with guilt. I informed Mark about Grace's peculiar behavior the previous evening and inquired whether she and Jared were still communicating or planning another meeting. Mark checked the messages and confirmed she just responded to him a few minutes ago. He invited her to lunch at the beach club tomorrow, suggesting they devise a strategy to convince you. His exact words were, "Simon loves you, and if you tell him it won't be cheating, he can't deny you a free pass." She replied with a simple, "Okay." After ending the call, I sat back in my chair, contemplating my next course of action. A direct conversation wouldn't be effective. Jared was applying too much pressure. If confronted, he'd likely find alternative methods to entice her, perhaps even arranging a hotel rendezvous. I realized I had to either stop this or end my marriage. I dialed Kyle and went straight to the point. Jared's making a move on Grace, and even if I intervene now, he'll probably push for a hotel meeting. I need a solid plan, or I'm considering divorce. I feel like I need a backup plan. What are your thoughts? Kyle paused briefly before responding. Having a backup plan is wise, but if it fails, Jared won't give up easily. His ego won't allow him to lose her. If forgiveness isn't an option, divorce might be unavoidable. I can prepare the necessary documents for your attorney, or I can recommend one. I have my own lawyer, thanks, I replied. Hoon's already drafted a business agreement protected by a trust in case this goes south. I contacted my lawyer and scheduled a meeting for the next morning. When I arrived at his office at 9:30, he gave me a knowing look. What changed? He asked with a wry smile. He knew me too well. I chuckled softly, accepting a cup of coffee from his secretary. Grace is on the brink of infidelity, I explained. A salesman at her work has targeted her, and she's falling for it. I'm contemplating ending the marriage, but I'm developing a backup plan. If she goes through with it, though, there's no plan B. We spent the next hour discussing potential outcomes. I was leaning towards a straightforward divorce. Our business assets were already protected by the agreement, and since we didn't have children, child support wasn't a concern. We agreed to sell the house and divide everything equally. I had no interest in pursuing legal action against Jared or his employer. It would be costly, with little chance of success. After finalizing the details and the fee, I left my lawyer's office reassured that everything was prepared and stored for future use, just in case. Throughout the week, Grace's behavior was erratic. One evening she was affectionate, the next she barely seemed aware of my presence. Then, on Friday afternoon, Zoe, one of my employees, called to inform me that Grace had received another large bouquet of flowers accompanied by a postcard. That was the final straw. While typing a message in the WhatsApp group, I noticed a post from Kyle to Billy. Jared had invited Billy's wife to dinner at the Holiday Inn. We all understood Jared's motives, but things were still uncertain. I encouraged Billy to join forces with me, hoping he would take action soon. I desperately wanted my situation resolved. I was so distracted that I kept dropping things. I messaged the group, updating Mark about the flowers and the card. He responded quickly, "I'll check her email now." 5 minutes later, my phone rang. "Check your WhatsApp," Mark said. Opening the app, I saw a document. A hotel reservation for the Lakeside Inn, about 30 minutes outside the city. The booking was for Friday and Saturday nights, and both Grace's and Jared's names were listed. Returning to the call, I relayed the bad news to Mark. He sighed and confirmed, "Yeah, but it gets worse. The emails are even more damning. I'm sending you one now." When I opened my inbox, I found an email from Grace outlining precisely what to say and do. It was essentially a cheater's guide. Jared had sent her the hotel link 2 weeks prior, and their email exchange revealed him encouraging her, describing how much he wanted to pamper her. In the final message, he confirmed the reservation and provided her with a script to convince me everything was fine. According to his plan, she was supposed to cook me a nice dinner, act exceptionally affectionate throughout the week, and assure me that her encounter with him was purely physical, intended only to enhance our relationship. He left the decision in her hands, but it was evident she was inclined to proceed. I needed time to think. That weekend, we stayed busy. I didn't reveal my knowledge, but Grace's behavior shifted. She was unusually affectionate. Grace and I were intimate several times Friday night and Saturday morning, then again Saturday night. On Sunday afternoon, she initiated another encounter, and yet again on Monday morning. It felt as if she was trying to reassure either herself or me, but by Monday afternoon, I was tired of the charade. Kyle phoned around 3 p.m. with further distressing news. Grace had texted Jared, saying she was available Thursday night, but only if he was comfortable. Kyle cautioned me that Jared's reply was essentially, "Forgiveness is easier than permission." I expressed my gratitude to Kyle for the information and requested he gather all the evidence, mentioning there were probably pictures. Kyle verified they had a photo of Jared and Grace kissing, although not a full-blown makeout session. I instructed him to assemble everything in a folder and forward it to my attorney. I subsequently reached out to my lawyer, informing him to anticipate the folder. We scheduled a meeting for Saturday morning. Nothing spoils breakfast quite like divorce papers, I dryly observed. On Monday night, Grace attempted intimacy again, but I declined, claiming I had work to do. I remained in my office late into the night, eventually retiring around 2 a.m. She was already asleep. The following morning, as I was leaving for work, a courier delivered the complete folder. I opened it in my office, reviewing the contents. Emails, photographs, and notes that exposed the extent of their affair. Jared had wrecked at least 7 marriages in the past 18 months, and it appeared ours was next. As I finished reading, Lauren, my secretary, entered. I recounted the whole ordeal to her. Her expression softened with compassion, and for the first time, I perceived her as more than just a colleague. There was something undeniably appealing about her. She smiled knowingly and inquired, "So, what's the plan?" A slight smile touched my lips. "If she goes through with it on Friday, I'll file for divorce on Saturday." Lauren grinned playfully. "Well, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, right?" She leaned in. "Why not have your own weekend fling with someone you've been fantasizing about?" I chuckled. "And who might that be?" "Me, of course," she replied, flashing a mischievous smile. "Strictly physical, nothing more. You need a clear head, and I'm just the woman to assist with that." The concept was straightforward yet potent. Make Grace confront the repercussions of her infidelity. That night I was with Grace, but there was no emotional connection for me. It was a difficult performance. By Wednesday morning, neither of us was inclined toward our usual brief exchange before work. The tension was escalating, and Thursday would be the breaking point. By Wednesday evening, the strain had lessened slightly, but it remained, simmering beneath the surface. Thursday morning, as I prepared to depart, Grace awoke and shouted something regarding dinner plans, but I opted to ignore her. Around noon, Kyle called with another development. Grace had messaged Jared, bragging about preparing a special dinner for me and promising to update him on our subsequent discussion. I resolved to preempt her. I went to the supermarket and purchased everything I needed: chicken, potatoes, vegetables, and a bottle of her favorite white wine. By 2:30 p.m., I was home, and within a few hours, everything was prepared and in the oven. Just as I was placing the potatoes inside, Grace arrived, carrying several shopping bags. She appeared perplexed, clearly not anticipating dinner already underway. "What are you up to?" Grace asked, observing the meal preparations with evident confusion as she put down her bags. I grinned broadly, attempting to maintain a light-hearted atmosphere. "Just making dinner for my lovely wife. I wanted to make it special before we sit down and have a chat." She looked even more bewildered, her brow furrowing. "Oh, I was planning on making dinner too. But after we eat, I have something important to discuss with you. It's going to be a long night." "Of course," I replied, turning away with a smile. I had already disrupted her plans, and she was completely unaware. Dinner was strained. I kept the conversation flowing, deflecting any attempts to steer it toward personal matters. Grace tried to push the conversation in that direction several times, but I encouraged her to enjoy the meal first. Once we were finished, I decided it was time to seize control. "Bring your wine to the kitchen. Let's talk in there," I suggested, gesturing towards the kitchen table, where I had discreetly positioned a folder earlier. The letter, the evidence, everything she needed to see was concealed beneath a couple of magazines. She followed me, still oblivious to what was coming. I removed the magazines, revealing the printed document. "Grace," I began, "you know I love you, and I never want to hurt you, but we've been together for a long time, and I've come to realize something. My lack of experience has been troubling me, and it's become more apparent lately." Her eyes widened slightly, and I could see her attempting to comprehend where this was headed. My secretary, Lauren, well, she's been confiding in me, and I've found myself drawn to her stories. They're captivating. I feel like I need to clear my head before we can fully commit to spending our lives together. So, I've booked a hotel for the weekend with her. It's just, physically, it was a chance to release some pent-up energy and experiment with new things I could bring back to our marriage. It wouldn't change my feelings for her, and I was being upfront, so it wouldn't be construed as infidelity. Grace's face turned crimson, her expression wavering between fury and disbelief. "Over my dead body," she practically yelled. "And I want this woman gone by Monday morning, or we're done." Her reaction was precisely what I anticipated, and I couldn't suppress a laugh. The look on her face was invaluable as the realization hit her. She'd seen through my charade. Every point she'd planned to make, every excuse she'd rehearsed, I'd foreseen it all. I closed the folder and presented it to her, revealing the photo on the front. Her and Jared, embraced in a kiss. The color drained from her face. "You knew," she whispered, "and you played me." "Yes," I replied calmly, my smile fading. "I knew. Your reaction mirrors how I would have felt if our positions were reversed. But unlike you, I didn't reserve a hotel room. Unlike you, I didn't share lunches, kisses, or intimate conversations with someone else. My scenario was fabricated. Yours, however, is quite real." As I spoke, she flipped through the folder, her hands shaking. Dates, times, photographs, emails, call transcripts. It was all documented. "You followed me. You invaded my privacy. How could you?" she demanded, her voice laced with anger. I remained composed. "That's the point, Grace. You've overstepped a boundary, and now it's time for consequences. You acquired a boyfriend, engaged in an emotional affair, and were planning to consummate it. You've humiliated me and jeopardized our marriage, and yet you're angry at me for catching you before it went too far. I believed we could work through this, but perhaps I was mistaken." Her eyes welled up as she attempted to justify herself. "Humiliated you? You put our marriage at risk, Simon." "It wasn't like that. It was separate from us." "Separate from us?" I echoed incredulously. "That's straight from the cheater's playbook. You told me earlier that if I had an affair, it would be over your dead body. So why is it acceptable for you, but not for me?" She started to speak, but I raised my hand to silence her. "No, Grace. There's no such thing as a free pass. If you proceed with this, it's cheating, and informing me beforehand doesn't alter that fact." Her gaze fell to the floor. I can't deal with this right now. I need to be alone." Without another word, she turned and fled upstairs, taking the folder with her. I heard the bedroom door slam and the lock click. I cleaned the kitchen, my mind already racing with what to do next. Kyle had provided me with a tablet to monitor Grace's phone activity. I sat down and logged in. As expected, she was messaging Jared. I scrolled through their exchange. Grace's most recent message expressed doubt. She was worried someone might be watching them, that someone had copies of their messages. She even mentioned how I'd cooked dinner for her that night and seemed to know more than I was letting on. Jared's response was predictable. He told her not to worry, to proceed with the weekend as planned, and everything would be fine. He reassured her that her feelings for him were genuine and that they had to follow their plan. His desperation was almost tangible. Grace, however, was wavering. She told him I was acting strangely, that I seemed to have figured everything out. She admitted to having second thoughts, that maybe this wasn't the right move. But Jared persisted, arguing that it wouldn't be cheating if I knew. He insisted it would only make her happier. I shut down the tablet and switched on the TV, though my mind was elsewhere. I'd already decided to file for divorce, but I was torn between doing it now or waiting until they'd actually followed through. A part of me wanted to ensure she fully grasped the consequences of her actions before I made any final decisions. I called my lawyer and brought him up to speed. "I dropped the bomb on her," I said, "and she's preparing to leave and see how I react. I don't want to file for divorce until they've actually slept together, but I need her to know I'm serious. Is there any way we can expedite this?" My lawyer, sharp as always, had a proposal. "We could serve her a letter at her office tomorrow, stating unequivocally that you're aware of the affair and that if she proceeds, divorce proceedings will begin the following morning. She'll get the message loud and clear." I agreed. Thinking it over, it was the perfect way to demonstrate how serious I was. Later that night, I checked the tablet again. No further messages between Grace and Jared. I decided to call it a night. When I reached the bedroom, I half expected the door to still be locked, but it wasn't. I entered to find Grace lying in bed, her packed bag against the wall. Seeing that bag triggered a wave of emotions. I didn't speak. I simply turned and walked out, heading straight for the guest bedroom. She called after me, pleading, but I ignored her. Lying in bed, fully clothed, I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. The bag, packed and ready for her to run off with Jared, was the final blow. Tears welled up in my eyes. Tears welled up, and I let them fall. I had lost something fundamental, and there was no recovering from it. The next morning, I heard her moving around downstairs. I remained in the guest room, waiting until I heard the front door close. When I finally went down to the kitchen, I saw the bag was gone. Grace had unpacked it and put everything away. She stood by the counter, her face drawn and anxious. My initial reaction was to lash out, but I held back. I suppose this breakfast is your way of showing me what kind of wife you'll be if you sleep with another man. But it doesn't matter. If you go through with it, we're done. She looked at me, her eyes pleading, but I didn't let her speak. I've already spoken with the lawyer, I continued, my voice firm. You'll be served with divorce papers tomorrow morning at the hotel. There's no turning back after that. If you come home tonight, we'll start counseling and try to rebuild. But if you leave with him, don't even consider coming back. Grace's face crumpled, but she said nothing. I glanced at her bag by the door. I assume the bag's already in your car? She turned away, confirming my suspicion. Without saying another word, Grace picked up her things and quietly left the house. The sound of the door closing echoed through the empty kitchen, leaving me standing alone in the silence. At least Grace finally understood the gravity of her actions. When I got to the office, Lauren took one look at me and said, "You look terrible." I gave her a weak grin. "And you look as stunning as ever." Before she could ask more questions, I added, "I have no idea how things will turn out." When I laid out my plan B, Grace flew into a rage. She said, "Over my dead body." This morning, I packed my weekend bag. She's going to receive a letter soon, and we'll see if it rattles her. Lauren brewed more coffee and handed me a cup. I hope she realizes what she's doing. Surely she can't think this behavior is okay for her, but not for you. I offered her a sad smile and settled at my desk. The day felt unproductive, and right after 11 o'clock my phone rang. It was Grace, and she was crying. "Are you serious?" she sobbed. "Are you really going to divorce me?" It was clear she hadn't expected me to follow through. I didn't hesitate. "If you go through with it, it's a breach of our agreement. You'd divorce me if I cheated, right?" Her voice was barely audible, but she whispered, "Yes." "Will you come home so we can talk?" she pleaded. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, I replied, and hung up. When I got home, I brewed some coffee. The smell of the bacon she had cooked earlier still lingered in the air. I opened a window to air out the kitchen and sat down. 10 minutes later, Grace came through the door, holding an envelope for my lawyer in one hand and her weekend bag slung over her shoulder. She dropped the bag at the door, looking unsure whether to come to me or stay back. I poured the coffee and gestured for her to sit down. "So, are you still planning to go to the hotel?" I asked, watching her closely. Her face flushed. "How can you ask that after sending this?" She waved the letter from the lawyer. "Of course I'm not going. I love you. I want to be with you. I canceled everything. But do we need to fix our marriage? Or am I still going to be served with divorce papers?" I studied her for a moment before speaking. "You'll only be served if you show up at that hotel. No hotel, no papers. But our marriage has been damaged, Grace. This is what's going to happen. First, you're going to call Jared in front of me, and I want to hear you end it. Then you're going to delete the personal email account you made for him. After that, you'll report everything to your boss and make sure Jared's banned from your office. Finally, we'll start counseling to figure out why this happened and how we can rebuild our trust." Just as I finished, her phone rang. It was Jared. She put it on speaker, and his frustrated voice came through. "Where are you, Grace? I'm waiting at the reception and can't wait any longer." Grace took a deep breath and said, "Jared, I'm home with Simon. He did something that made me realize what I was doing. If I go with you, it'll destroy my marriage. I'm sorry, but you're not worth it. I'm not coming. Jared's anger was palpable. You're a fool. Do you know how much time, effort, and money I've spent on you? And now you're backing out because your weakling husband threw a tantrum? Screw you, he shouted before hanging up. For the first time, Grace saw him for what he truly was. It wasn't love or care. It was manipulation. She took a moment to gather herself and then began deleting the email account. It took longer than expected, but after an hour, it was gone. Not long after, her boss and the HR manager, Marvin Woods, showed up at our door. They looked serious. Grace, we're aware of what happened today, Woods said. To say we're disappointed is an understatement, but we're here to give you a chance to keep your job. Please tell us what happened. Grace took a deep breath and dabbed her eyes with a tissue. About 3 months ago, Jared Nelson took over the AM Metals account I managed. He started with compliments, harmless things about my clothes and hair. But then it got personal. He began flirting, sending me gifts, and eventually asked me to dinner. I let it happen, and I started dressing provocatively to get his attention. Over time, he wore me down with his words claiming I was too good for Simon had almost worked. He'd nearly convinced me to spend a weekend away with him, but Simon's lawyer intervened with a letter, jolting me back to reality. I immediately told Jared I wasn't going and reported the entire incident to HR. I felt ready to put this behind me. Woods shared a look with Grace's supervisor before nodding. Thank you for your honesty, Grace. While you made a significant mistake, you're fortunate to have a second chance. We've been experiencing quality problems with Metals and are terminating our contract with them. Jared Nelson will no longer be visiting this office. Let me be clear. Any recurrence of this will result in your immediate dismissal. Grace nodded. I understand. After they departed, Grace and I had lunch together. Later that afternoon, we began the search for a marriage counselor. Luckily, we found one quickly and scheduled a session for the following day. The counseling proved beneficial over the next 3 months. Grace came to understand how Jared had preyed on her anxieties about our marriage becoming stagnant. She recognized the ease with which he manipulated her. I, in turn, realized the depth of our bond and developed a deeper appreciation for the resilience of our relationship. Years later, we're still together, and Grace is expecting our first child. We've overcome a lot, and our relationship is stronger than ever. As for Jared, he hasn't fared so well. A few months ago, he took a nasty tumble down a flight of stairs at the local shopping mall parking lot. The police were unable to determine exactly what happened, but I'm aware of a few things. There were at least 5 husbands present at the mall that day, all wearing black jackets and baseball caps. When the police attempted to separate us for questioning, no one cooperated. We moved around so much they couldn't keep track of who was where, and none of us spoke a word. One thing is certain, someone ensured Jared got his just desserts. But as for who, well, that's a secret none of us will ever divulge.